has been repeatedly expressed in these weeks that the pandemic has somehow accentuated trends already existing, has not really changed the picture of the world as it is. And the picture of the world was already such as to clearly impose upon us the big question: is the US being superseded by China as the new leader of the world or not? Now, China happened to be the protagonist also of the pandemic, which was not expected some months ago. Well, let me say on this something on leadership. We have to say something on leadership because my personal opinion is that leadership, of course, depends on the economy. The biggest and most important economy of the world is one of the requisites for that country to be leader. Military power, military forces are perhaps equally important. The US, during the last decades, had the first economy of the world, and it was the first in terms of military power, but these were not the only reasons for that country to be leader. You can have the first economy and the first military strength of the world, you are going to be the first one, not necessarily the leader. And the first one is not a leader by definition. A leader is leading the others somewhere. So what also, I say also, made the US the leader in the second part of the last century and in the initial years of this century was the fact that there was a vision, a path for the future, something that has to do, we can go together somewhere. Of course, this role was largely due to the fact that in the first decades, initially it was democracy versus the totalitarian regimes of the first part of the 20th century. The US was leading at a certain point the free world against these totalitarian regimes. And then there was the fight against communism. So leading, you can share the vision or not, this is not important. The fact of the matter is that there was a vision of the world, there was liberal democracy at stake, and the US was the leading country in defending liberal democracy. The first economy, the first military power. Now, it is quite clear that nowadays, the US has lost the third requisite, the immaterial, the intangible benefit of the vision around which part of the world is gathered under my leadership. It has been waiving directly this role, mostly with the current president. As Richard Haas rightly wrote a couple of days ago, the current president has adopted the withdrawal doctrine, withdrawing from whatever agreement or threatening to withdraw from international organizations, unraveling the network of international relationships in which this kind of leadership could be exercised. You might say, well, but this is temporary after all, not necessarily the next president assuming and personally hoping that the US will have a different president by the end of the year, well, might restore one way or another a role for the US to lead the rest of the world or part of the rest of the world. Maybe, but in the meantime, the other requisites of leadership, not the intangible, but the tangible, the role of the economy, the role of military forces might somehow go to the side of China. China might be, in a few years, not only the first economy, but perhaps also the first military power. We don't know. Paul Kennedy is now working on, I think it's finalizing a book. I read about it a couple of days ago, Victory at Sea, in which he describes the great effort of China to build a naval force with a lot of specialized kind of ships, etc. And this is quite a change of the picture for the future. Can we exclude that China will be the first economy and the first military power of the world in a few years? We cannot. Can we imply for this reason that China will replace the US of some years ago as the leaders of the world? I humbly submit that I don't think China can be a leader in the sense of the my third intangible requisite of leadership. There is nowhere where China can lead the world to, unless, but this is a separate chapter of our conversation, I don't know we will have the time to go into it, the urgency of the decisions to be taken in relation to climate change, survival of human being in the planet, a roadmap that does not allow delays in this area, might demonstrate that the authoritarian China can do better, more easily, more efficiently than liberal democracies. In which case, the appeal that is already growing of authoritarian regimes, China itself, might create also the condition of a leadership. But personally, I think this is unlikely. Therefore, my conclusion is the conclusion that Martin Wolf was drawing yesterday in the Financial Times discussing these things. We are going toward a world less cooperative than the pre-existing one, much more conflictual and much more difficult to run. And this is at the moment my conclusion.
Thank you very much. A very powerful set of arguments. I turn now to Professor Lisa Anderson.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you all, although I wish I was actually with you all, but perhaps next year. I want to make a few remarks that are really drawn on the observations I'm going to be making tomorrow about the shape of the Middle East. But I think in many ways, the Middle East shows us, for better or for worse, our future, which means, of course, it will be, in fact, more conflictual. But I've been struck in listening to the discussion over the last several days by the relative absence of what I think is one of the most important dynamics in the world today, growing inequality. And I think we really need to address that more directly. The accelerating erosion of sovereignty that's been prompted by globalization has clearly brought on defensive reactions among those left behind and fueled populist nationalisms. This is why Trump's supporters seem to share something with those of Orban and Modi and Bolsonaro and so forth. These figures are styling themselves the defenders of local national values, often perhaps inevitably conservative, suspicious, and self-pitying. Craig Calhoun addressed this in his call for a renewal of the nation, national solidarity, which he argued need not be anti-global. As he put it, there's no transnational without the national. But I don't actually think the principal dynamic that we need to be concerned with is global versus local, or liberal cosmopolitan versus communitarian local, so much as what I'll call Davos against the rest. Thanks to both technological change and globalization, and they feed each other, of course, in ways we can discuss, the global 1% has become unimaginably, obscenely wealthy. And in doing so, they have evaded as much notice, even by such an august group as this one, as they might have, because they have very effectively denied and avoided any public responsibility. They claim to be just trying to make a living, protect shareholder interests, innovate, or this is my favorite, enhance value creation. Yet, as we know, the global captains of industry and the financiers of the world have captured many of the erstwhile public servants, the governments and national authorities, touting public-private partnerships, celebrating flexibility in the mobility of goods and services, not to say capital, the importance of liberating the dynamism of capitalism from the heavy hand of regulation. This global elite has awed the world's erstwhile public servants with promises of Ponzi scheme-like rates of growth based on growing and largely unregulated debt financing and leverage. In many ways, the public-private partnership is in fact the modern realization and facade for Marx's observation that the executive of the modern state is nothing but a committee for the managing of the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. I'm sure you remember that. The people, both dazzled and disappointed by the whirlwind of trade deals and tax havens, outsourced labor, and so forth, are beginning to recognize that they are not benefiting. But they are confused, as we all are, about where to assign the blame. The public sector seems shrunken, weak, atrophied, unable to promote and protect the welfare of the citizens. So we don't trust our public institutions or our leaders. But are we really sure that we agree with Klaus Schwab of Davos that, quote, and I'm quoting him, private corporations are the trustees of society, clearly the best response to today's social and environmental challenges? I, for one, am not sure I agree with that. We may worry about the government's surveillance occasioned by the pandemic, but should Amazon and Facebook or Weibo and Alibaba really be developing our privacy policies, deciding on the uses and limits of surveillance? As Avishai Margalit observed yesterday, I think, we see a deliberate undermining of citizenship everywhere, as more and more people are excluded from access to rights by law or, interestingly, through contempt. Have you noticed the language of dehumanization that has become part of our ordinary public discourse? You all know what Duarte in the Philippines sounds like, or Bolsonaro, or even Trump on Mexican rapists and immigrants from, and you'll excuse me, he said it, shithole countries. But it's not just the autocrats that sound like this. Hillary Clinton's reference to Trump supporters as, quote, a basket of deplorables in the presidential campaign was taken as evidence, correctly, I think, of her own contempt for voters. Similarly, President Emmanuel Macron's characterization of protesters as slackers and his distinction between, and I quote, those who succeed and those who are nothing, has betrayed an unbecoming scorn for his fellow citizens. No one wants to be deplorable or despicable or crazed or, worst of all, nothing. But the lines are drawn. If you are not a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, if you are not even really fully human, the language of human rights rings hollow in a world, as Albena, as Manova put it, of the political economy of precarity. Perhaps if being a citizen is out of reach for so many people in the world today, being a consumer might work. You'll remember George W. Bush reminding people that the best way to respond to the 9/11 attacks was to go shopping. He said, get down to Disney World in Florida, take your family and enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed. But you have to have enough money to get to Disney World. And if you don't, perhaps being among the chosen, the whites, the Christians, the Hungarians, the Han Chinese, the Hindus, may be second or third best, but it's certainly better than nothing. Thus, I think the divisions in the world are not really liberal or communitarian, not really US or China, so much as Davos against the rest, a reflection of a dynamic capitalism that is producing a world divided between, as Macron put it, those who succeed and those who are nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting remarks and very thought-provoking. I now turn to Michael Walzer. Professor Walzer, please.
Well, I want to say a word about what was called the liberal world order under Western or American leadership. What was the liberal world order? And I'll say something about it, its politics, and then something about its economics. So first of all, the liberal world order until '89 was half a world order. And in our half of the world, there were a very large number of illiberal regimes, including some in South America, for example, that were as brutal and authoritarian as any that we see in the world today, still encompassed by the liberal world order. After '89, there was a brief moment when people actually thought there might be an actual liberal world order. But that was a very, very brief moment. And what we saw instead were new forms of authoritarianism, religious revival, radically unexpected by all the liberal intellectuals in the world. And American leadership of this liberal world order, after 1945, we stopped winning wars. This great military machine, we fought to a stalemate in Korea. We were devastatingly defeated in Vietnam. In Afghanistan, after one of the longest wars in our history, we are now negotiating the terms of surrender. In Iraq, we could not defeat either the Sunni or the Shia militias. We have been one of the most incompetent hegemonic powers, I think, in world history, politically, and maybe also militarily. We conquered Iraq in 3 weeks. In 2005, we organized a democratic election in which our candidate came in third, an outcome unprecedented in imperial history. So I'm not sure there ever was a liberal political order, except the US and Western Europe, the wonderful Marshall Plan, perhaps the best foreign policy that we ever had was that moment in the late 40s. So there was this small liberal world, and we ruled parts of the rest of the world, not very competently. I doubt that inequality in Brazil is greater now than it was in the 50s and 60s. Probably was greater then. So I'm skeptical about too much celebration of the liberal world order. And now consider it economically, which Lisa has already said some very powerful things about that. I guess the US brought some kind of stability at quite a price. The liberal world order was a time of multinational corporate aggrandizement on an extraordinary scale. Globalization has been largely the work of corporate elites. According to economists, there's been some reduction in world poverty, which may have been maybe turned around by the pandemic. There is certainly rising inequality in many of the developed countries. So I'm not sure I would want to celebrate the economic side of the liberal world order or of the age of American hegemony. That age is past, but I'm not sure what is coming will be all that different. We are moving back toward a world of spheres of influence, and there will be, I hope, an American-European sphere of influence, a Chinese sphere of influence, and possibly some smaller spheres, an Iranian sphere or a Russian sphere. And we will have to worry about wars at the margins of the spheres, which is what we always had to worry about. Korea and Vietnam were wars at the margins of the American and the Soviet spheres of influence. And that's a real worry. And it may be that before the spheres settle, there will be more wars or civil wars around the edges of American-European hegemony and Chinese and Iranian and Russian hegemony. I think that's a world that can be managed politically, even militarily. The really hard question is whether it can be managed environmentally and economically. And there, I don't think you should count on American management, even if the Democrats win the election. America will be less engaged than it was in the aftermath of the Second World War. What we really need is an American-European partnership to manage whatever part of the world we can manage, and the European role has to be important. I've been saying this for years. America needs a partner strong enough to say yes and no to the American government, and that has to be European. That has to be your work, and I just hope you are up to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another sobering intervention, and I'm really grateful to all three of you for putting together these talks. And I would like to give you three the opportunity to respond to one another if you would so desire. And then we also will be, of course, collecting questions. So if there is any one of you three who would like to just follow up on something that you heard, I welcome you. And if not, I will go right away to our first question, which comes from Albena Asmanova. George, I see.
Mentioned, all right. Something that Lisa said, yes, we should not leave the legislation on our privacy in the hands of corporate leaders. Just let us remember, however, that our states have given that authority to those corporate leaders. Just this week, some NGOs leaked information that in 2017, the European Commission issued an appeal to medical companies to start developing a vaccine, and they said no thanks because there is no profit in this, and so the European Commission left the issue there. So it is our political authorities that are granting that responsibility and that authority to the big corporations, and this is what we need to be pushing against. Right.
Thank you, Albena. Would anybody like to respond to that, or shall I?
Well, let me just I think that's true, but of course, who's been lobbying our political authorities but the corporates? So I think they really are. We need to see this hand in hand.
Right.
I'm going to go now to Najib George Awad.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for this interesting contributions. Allow me to be candid and to share with you my thought about that question of who should or who would lead the world and what kind of a leadership such a leader is going to manifest. In my humble opinion, I think the mere involvement in asking these questions in the midst of the crisis we live in right now and the world is in is irresponsible, if not irrelevant. Asking these questions now seems like, to me, like a ship wrecked deeply by a lethal storm, and the passengers are spending their time sitting around the table thinking, who is more qualified than others to lead the rest of the passengers in jumping into the lethal ocean? It's like putting intellectually, scientifically, the cart before the donkey. Something I personally come originally from Syria, and I proudly supported the revolution against al-Assad, and I supported the opposition. Now, in year 2013, which is just 2 years after the revolution started, all the different oppositional factions started to clash against each other, asking the question is, who among them is more qualified to lead Syria after al-Assad? And they did that before they even ousted al-Assad. We are academics. We are professors who have an obligation before our students to be scientific as much as we can. I humbly think the mere idea of leadership per se is irrelevant totally to billions of humans who are suffering at the moment in the world, like all of us. In the midst of the pandemic, I don't think we can really usefully speculate or theorize about leadership and who's going to lead and what kind of leadership and who's best to really make the world work better and be sure that the theory we will make will really apply to the world after the pandemic. We are still in the pandemic. We are still suffering from it. And I humbly think anything scientifically we say about such questions will be either psychological sentiments or subjective speculation. Sorry for speaking too long.
Oh, thank you, George. Would any of the panelists care to reply to that, about the usefulness of these?
Yes,
exercises,
yes,
please?
because we have to understand each other upon the sense of the question about the leadership. We are not here to decide who is the best of our group to lead the others. It's not a matter of selecting the best one when we speak of the leadership in the world. It's a real substantial problem that has to do with the reality of the world. The world works better, whatever the issue at stake, if there is more cooperation than conflict. And this can be taken as a basic principle. Cooperation is higher and more intense if there is a leadership. Because you may like the leader or dislike the leader. You may share the goals and the visions or not, but there is more cooperation, and therefore a common decision can be more easily taken, and right or wrong, you go somewhere. Of course, an entire world in the hands of the Nazi Germany would have a leader and would take the wrong decisions. It's too obvious. I mean, I don't need this kind of example. I certainly know that in relation to climate change and to the needs that we have to face, the fact that the previous leader of the world took a separate position and said, I'm not coming with you, destroyed any serious possibility to find a useful agreement. Because with the main economy, transport system, industrial system of the world remaining partially out of the agreement of Paris, you find yourself in a sort of mess. So the point is this one. Do we think that we could face the issues we have to face at the moment of the pandemic, when the pandemic will be over, the economic consequences of it, the policies that will be needed, the investments of all over the world to remedy the injuries, etc., etc. Do we think that a cooperative world would face all these things better or not? If we don't think that it would be better, we may not care about the leadership. The fact of the matter, because this was my conclusion, very close to what Michael was also saying, is that we are not we are not going to have leaders. We are going to have a sphere, as he was saying, of influence. I don't know how much the US, if it continues like this, will have a significant sphere of influence, and taking crucial decisions for the world. Just balancing different spheres of different influences will be quite a tough job for human beings.
Can I join in here? George's intervention was heartfelt, but I'm not sure what he wants us to do besides wring our hands. I would be very happy if there were a global social democratic movement addressing the inequalities that are visible now in the pandemic, both in countries and across the world, challenging the 1%, dealing with the environmental crisis. But there is no such global politics available to us. The crucial decisions about our future are going to be made within nation states in Europe, in America, in China, and in a few other places. And we need to think very seriously about how those decisions will be made and what we hope they will be.
Lisa Anderson, yes.
Jonathan, I'm saying.
May I bounce back and say one small comment?
I just wanted to let Lisa Anderson reply, and
Okay.
then I'll come back to you.
This is going to be quick, and it's a very, it's apropos Syria as much as it is apropos the conversation today. But one of the problems with using the uprisings in the Arab world as cases in point is that it was precisely because many of the revolutionaries did not want to assume leadership and did not want to think about how to organize for the post period, that the authoritarians were able to recapture control of the dynamics. So I think precisely it is important in the heat of the moment to be thinking about what the future is going to look like and how one might be able to shape that a little bit.
Thank you. Let me let George.
I saw there is a good question about Europe that suggests to me to take the point made by Michael Walzer and to revert it to offer to the other speakers. And the substance at the end of the intervention of Michael, the issue was a kind of request to support from Europe. He wanted to ask Europe to help the United States to improve their international performance. So one question is, will be Europe able to represent such a power, capable to put again the US on the track of a good Western leadership? And there is a question of Angela Fernandez de Castro Amaral is saying, but there is any moral risk that the European are working as a colonial power, which is also a legitimate question. So question is divided in two. Will be Europe able to do that? And the second, there is any more the risk of a colonial oppression driven from Europe?
Michael, would you be willing to take that?
Well, one of the promises of the EU was that it would create a new Europe, whose economy would be as large as the American economy, and whose political influence potentially could be powerful. Now, you have encountered difficulties along the way, and perhaps that the hope of those early years is fragile now. But I still believe that there is the potential in the EU to exercise, to do good things in the world, and to push America to do better than we have been doing.
So the presumption is that the European Union countries acting in the present context are acting on a more liberal democratic basis than they were in their colonial incarnation. I suppose is part of the assumption. But I see there's a question from Francesca Tarocco, and I wanted to turn to her. If you are we able to hear you, Francesca?
Jonathan, the question about what Europe can do, it's also a question for Lisa and Giuliano Amato.
Sorry, please. Giuliano Amato, would you like to address this issue of the potential leadership of Europe and the appropriateness of
well, I would be happy for it, but I think that Michael is a little bit optimistic because at the moment, the condition of Europe is just better than the American one for the simple reason that on the whole, we feel more at ease because we don't have the American president. But this is just the only significant difference to our advantage that I can see at the moment for structural reasons. You see, I mean, the idea that liberal democracy, meaning by liberal also open to social policies and therefore to the social democratic project, is clearly linked to a good role exercised by Europe. This is, I am convinced, exactly like Michael, that the alliance between the US and Europe in the world of today might have this good meaning, somehow influencing each other positively in this sense. But we have to cope with the structural reasons that make today the necessary policies difficult and that make liberal democracy so fragile vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis the progress of populism, of nationalism, of majoritarian democracy or illiberal democracy, as it is named by one of its inventors, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Now, we have to think of the reasons for these political developments to be so relevant and significant. And the reasons has to do with the economic and social inequalities that have grown so heavily in the last decades, creating dissatisfaction, anxieties, anger, and substantially breaking up the social compromise that capitalism and social democratic values have succeeded in realizing, obtaining in the past century. This is the point. With inequalities growing, social ladder that has remained paralyzed, no prospects for the future, lower salaries, etc. People abandon the loyalty toward the political visions they had in the past and are ready to follow leaders and political movements that go nationalist, that go majoritarian, that go illiberal. That's the point. We are still dealing with this problem. So the question is, do we have the reasonable prospect that this is going to change, that the pandemic gives us a hand to change toward the right direction? Because if this is so, if we succeed in rescuing the social environment for our visions and policies to prevail, at that point, the US-Europe alliance might make the sense that we want it to make. Otherwise, I don't know. And we know that there are intellectuals and scholars nowadays who have several doubts about the future because they don't know what's going to happen. Now, I must say, and I finish immediately, that after all, the consent toward policies aiming at sustainable development, where sustainable means both from the angle of the environment and also socially, are more and more. That mostly after the pandemic, people will say now it's time not only for the shareholders, but also for the stakeholders to be protagonists and beneficiaries of economic life, etc., etc., etc. I mean, this is a change that is occurring, but let me notice that in Europe, the only political leader that seems to have these things in mind is an old leader who is happily recovering from a difficult situation of months ago, Angela Merkel. But if I look at the new political leaders, I'm not so optimistic.
Lisa, there were some points that were echoed in that last response. Is there anything that you would like to add to that, especially in terms of what kind of opportunity might have been, or what kind of opportunities might yet emerge as sort of institutional windows for the state to play a lot of these roles that you are I think, correctly suggesting it might rest from the hands of private corporations, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I essentially agree with both, with all of the remarks that have been said about this. I think the, the capacity to think about whether Europe is going to be able to resume a constructive role in supporting and harnessing the United States is, it's an open question. I don't think it's clear. I don't think it's clear that the United States is going to resume the kind of quasi-constructive role it ever played in the past. I think Michael's earlier observations that are sort of, nostalgia for that liberal moment might be a little bit blinkered. And I just want to say one thing about the observation about whether were the Europeans and Americans to resume the kind of collaborative relationship they once had, whether that would be an opening for neo-colonialism. I actually think one of the interesting things that's happened in the last 50 years is the extent to which what was once a global divide between the liberals at home in Europe and the North Atlantic and the imperial domains in the rest of the world has been internalized in Europe and the United States. Immigration has changed the complexion, literally and figuratively, of the countries around the North Atlantic, making some of those tensions actually now domestic issues. So if you look at the United States and you look at the impact of the pandemic, which is one of the reasons why I think it is appropriate to be thinking about these questions in the midst of the pandemic, this is not a disease that doesn't discriminate. It does discriminate. It is very clearly much more damaging to communities of color, to poor people and so forth, than to the elite of the country. So in a sense, you see the pandemic playing out at the domestic level, some of the kinds of things that we used to think of as global imperialism. So I think it's going to be a pretty complicated, sort of pulling apart what's local, what's domestic, what's global, what's transnational, what's international institutions and so forth. But I do think that this is the moment to be thinking about this because, of course, you know, the post-war World War II world was designed during the war. So we ought to be doing a lot of important designing right now.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me turn now to Francesca Tarocco before turning to the chat where some students have begun to enter their questions as well. So please, Professor Tarocco.
Hi, yeah, I'm no political theorist or political scientist. I'm really a historian of China. And so, you know, many of the things you say are fascinating to me, but not really exactly what I work on. Something I've been struggling with, though, when I read a lot of the reporting, you know, in the US right now, and I've been working for many years also for an American institution, for the New York University in Shanghai, so living in a very cosmopolitan city with a very cosmopolitan, you know, student population, and very diverse student population, perhaps one of the most diverse student populations I've ever had in my whole career, and seeing, you know, teaching that kind of classroom, so very much in tune with what Lisa says about, you know, thinking about the future, dreaming up the future, and what Angela Morici was saying. One thing that's always strikes me is that one doesn't seem to be thinking in the West, right? One doesn't seem to be thinking about peace. We always somewhat, while we are thinking about politics or economics, we think about the military. We think about war. We think about power, and we think about the elite and the hegemon. All this terminology is a very, far away from many of the sources I deal with in my daily life, thinking in terms of medieval Chinese history, as well as, you know, post-medieval and late imperial Chinese history, where a lot of the language is about peace and maintaining stability and maintaining and creating consensus. And there are, in fact, if one looks back at the historical record, many, many, many centuries of exactly that in terms of, you know, whatever we call China now, in terms of maintaining equilibrium through various means, diplomatic, religious, and so on and so forth, you know, in that very vast part of the world, which is, you know, Eurasia, as well as the Sinosphere. And all of that really was done through, you know, gift exchanging, you know, agricultural means, sustaining economies, creating other economies. And it's true that, you know, the world is a different place now in the 20th and 21st century. But I think a lot of that is still very much present. A lot of that language, a lot of those means were, you know, through Buddhism or through the creation of ecological system, even in the minds of you know, very much secular members of, you know, and whatever you want to call them, you know, the people who run the show right now in, you know, in China, the Sinosphere, and Southeast Asia. But yeah, that kind of, I don't want to use a strong word, but I don't want to say ignorance. Let's say how oblivious, you know, Americans and Europeans seem to be of that world. And they don't even want to think about that. And they don't even want to bring up the term peace ever in this conversation. Seems to me very striking. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any panelists who would like to respond to that, Michael? Lisa?
Well, I think it is very important now to recognize the role that China is playing in the world. One of the difficulties with recognizing the possibility of a creative work outside of China is the need to recognize the destructive work going on inside China with regard to the Muslim minority in the northwest, northeast, northwest, and with regard to Hong Kong. But the Chinese have spent huge amounts of money in Africa. The money is loans, and many African states are going to turn out to be incapable of repaying the loans. And then the Chinese will be forced, I hope, to forgive much of those loans if they want to retain their influence in large parts of Africa. And I think we need a division of labor of that sort. We need Chinese investment in parts of the world where that investment can do good things. We should welcome it. And we should hope that they discover how much it costs, and that they decide to pay the costs. And that's part of what I mean when I think about spheres of influence. That's the way they get established. But right now, how the liberal Western democratic world deals with China's internal politics, that is a very hard question, and probably our response is going to be largely gestural, but I at least hope the gestures are strong ones.
Thank you. Would any other panelists care to reply right now? So I have another couple of questions that have come up in the chat. One of them builds on that last exchange regarding the potential role of China in the fight against the coronavirus as an opportunity to achieve a new level of world protagonism, and whether or not this could be something that we see. And another question coming from Stanislav Molchanov is a quote: "If we were to treat billionaires as a policy failure, perhaps if we were to go so far as to compel our legislators to pass bills outlawing extreme wealth, could we mitigate some of the harms of global inequality?" He then continues, "We would have to think up new ways of valuing people, and that might require a change in how economists consider economic productivity. But at least that would tamp down on the damage done by the prosperity gospel." May I invite the panel's thoughts on either of those questions?
I'm happy to take the question of billionaires as a policy failure, because I think that's a lovely way to put it. Yes, I do think that we should treat billionaires as a policy failure. It's not clear to me that simply outlawing being a billionaire is the final response that we might want to have, because it depends on what then those taxes, and that's presumably how we would ensure that no billionaires developed in the future, how those taxes are deployed. It would require strengthening a public sector that has been eroded for some time. So yes, I think packed into that question is a whole set of things that we need to be thinking far more about. How economists value people would be an interesting place to start.
Thank you. President Amato or Michael Walzer?
I agree with everything Lisa just said.
Thank you.
I was struggling with my microphone. There were two questions. Of course, billionaires are not helpful in convincing people that our liberal democracies are the temple of democracy and equality. And the evidence offered not by having the billions as such, but this has always been my main conviction, that billions create separate lives, create that kind of phenomenon against which there were the revolutions of 3 centuries ago. The fact that their children don't go to the ordinary schools, that they don't choose the means of transport that other people use, the fact that they are a sort of separate kind of dynasties, that whatever kind of mobility we can create, we will never reach that separate paradise of human beings that is separate as it, and this paradise for something that has gone wrong in our systems of governance, whatever they are. So this remains even in systems in which social mobility does exist. This remains as an injury that creates tension. Can you imagine the impact of this tension when instead of having social mobility, instead of having for my children the hope of a better future than my own life, I understand that my children will have a worse future, a lower income and lower prospects. So this is part of the difficulties that liberal democracy nowadays has, and that creates a question mark on the future. Let me say on China that I am an old friend of the Chinese. I went to China for the first time immediately after they got rid of the Gang of Four. So it was in 77, 78, many, many years ago. And I found people very similar to the Italians for many, many reasons, very similar to the Italians. And at the time, I had the expectation that President Deng arriving, there could be developments leading toward a more liberalized economy and also a more liberalized political system. What is difficult for me to accept there is the fact that it seems that despite the partial liberalization of the economy, the political system for them has to remain as it is, with the firm centralized authority of the party. And don't tell me, now a member of a constitutional court, that the constitutionality of their laws is decided upon by a commission of the party. This is something that I personally cannot accept. There is no reason that convince me of something like that. So this problem for the future exists. It is correct that they want peace. I can't imagine the Chinese army arriving somewhere else the same way as the US Marines arrived somewhere else. So this is relevant for the future balance of the world. But an authoritarian system like that is, in my view, in a good position to run China, but not in a good position to lead the outside world.
Well, my point was really only, it was a call to, knowing more about each other. As I said, I'm a historian, so I deal with pre-modern materials, and I'm not, but what I see in these pre-modern materials, and I see that reflected in many of the language and the politics, and the, let's forget about all that, you know, whatever Neo-Confucian rubbish, but, you know, there are all these older layers about creating stability and creating prosperity that are very much alive in people's lives and in the mentalities and the cosmologies that still constitute that part of the world. And I think that, you know, to ignore that and to not think, not dream of possibilities that emerge from, you know, multilateral engagement based on mutual knowledge, and not just the assumption that, you know, that this particular historical formation that is the West is the only one that has produced, as I said, you know, language, ideas, and methodologies to prosper and to create prosperity. And I agree, of course, very much with you that the party state is, you know, in many ways, you know, dreadful. And I've lived, you know, I speak Chinese, I've lived in China for many years, and all of that, I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what it is to be a Chinese passport. You know, well, I'm not one of them, but I know very deeply what that is. I was there since in my 20s, you know, so I have a very profound knowledge of the place. But what I'm saying is that I find it striking that you know, stereotypes are reproduced constantly in the language of political theory and political science. And so anyway, that was the point. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to just turn quickly to Jose Casanova because we only have a minute left, but please, Jose, go ahead.
I actually agree very much with Professor Tarocco. And this was the model, of course, when China was not part of the Westphalian system. And all the model of discourse comes from the experience precisely of the Westphalian system, and it was globalized. The problem is that China, of course, has become now a nation state and reproduces precisely this model. China could solve the problem of the Uyghurs, the problem of the Tibetans within its own imperial system. But now, of course, it cannot recognize Chinese outside of China, needs to incorporate them into the nation states, so cannot give autonomy to Taiwan, cannot give autonomy to Hong Kong, and cannot give precisely difference, the plurality, the pluralism that was part of the Chinese empire has been destroyed by the model of the nation state, which they have imported indeed from us, from the Westphalian system. So now we are in trouble, because I think that for the Chinese, although still those cosmologies are there at the personal level, I think at the institutional level, the model of the nation state is basically reproducing in China the worst aspects of precisely the Westphalian model.
Thank you, Jose. And there's much more conversation to be had on that topic, as well as on the really fascinating topic of the future of social democracy, which I know Albena Asmanova wanted to revisit. And I'm sorry, especially speaking as I am from the jurisdiction of Senator Elizabeth Warren, I'm always happy to hear about new policy proposals regarding billionaires. But I would like really to thank very sincerely our three speakers, Lisa Anderson, Giuliano Amato, and Michael Walzer, for making this such a fascinating and thought-provoking roundtable. I'm truly grateful to each of you for the time and thought you dedicated to this, and to everyone for participating in the conversation. And thanks, of course, to our poor suffering translators as well. I know that our microphones are not ideal, and please accept my apology on our behalf. And I invite you all to reconvene in just 13 minutes when the final panel of today's Venice seminars will conclude with Professor Sudipta Kaviraj and Professor Adam Seligman.